All right, we're back. I guess let me take off the attention. Okay. Welcome to, it is not 2016. It is in fact 2017. Look at that. Okay, we did some sentence correction today. We got some problems with parallelism, which in fact, this is actually the single most commonly tested topic. Like, of all the single topics in sentence correction, like of all the things that are legitimately single topics, this is the most frequently tested of all of them. Because it's, the reason why they test it so much is that it pretty much works in every language in the world in pretty much exactly the same way, with minor differences that are not significant. I mean, basically every language has parallelism. So just to give you a very basic idea, if you're not familiar with the term, I mean, the 15-second example is if I write, I like swimming and to run, those are not parallel. Give me that smiley face thing, if that makes sense. Make sure, I don't know what level everybody's on with this stuff. We might have some people here who have never seen this stuff. So these don't match. They're not parallel. They should match. Versus if you say something like, I like swimming and running. That works. That's what you want. So the first one of those would not work. The second one of those works. Okay. Smiley face, if that makes sense. Remember, please do not type smileys in the chat. Just makes sense. Give me that icon that's below your name. Cool. All right, let's move on to some problems. Here's the copyright notice again, just so that the copyright notice shows up on the recording. These problems are all from the free GMAT Prep software. Also remember that when we do sentence correction, whenever we have a theme in sentence correction, you kind of have an unfair advantage in the sense that you know that all of today's problems are at least going to contain the theme of today, which is parallel structure. Like, you know that is definitely going to be a thing. So when you do today's problems, the point is that you should look for the parallel stuff first, and then like basically everything else second. So, which you don't have that kind of advantage when you take the real test. The real test is not going to announce the topic of the problem, but that's what's going to let you focus on that here. That's how you're going to learn from it. So here's a problem. Remember where you find multiple choice problem answers. Those are here. Is the wrong screenshot. Okay. There we go. Okay, please do not answer questions in the chat box. This is where you get multiple choice answers, because I have more people than usual putting things in the chat box where they don't belong. Go for it. Shouldn't take too long, because again, you also know that today's problems will have parallelism in them. So they shouldn't take as long. Okay, go for it. Okay, we have mostly answered this. There's a couple of you who haven't. Again, remember how the test works. This is a test where you have to answer all the things all the time. So I'll wait like another 10 seconds or so for you to answer it. Okay, this problem's kind of a warm-up of sorts. You can think of it as intro. I mean, especially given that we have announced that we are talking about parallel structure today. Parallelism. Yeah, whether things that are supposed to match, do they match or not? This is basically a thing. So, okay. Let's talk about that. I mean, what are the things here that are supposed to match each other? If you want to tell me in the chat box. There's like, what are the ideas? What we don't want to do here is start tossing around grammar terms like clauses and stuff. Yeah, there's patients have to be warned about stuff, and a panel has to evaluate the experiment. I mean, again, if we go back to this little example here, like people who are using words like clauses and stuff, you really don't want to do that with parallel structure. Because, I mean, this stuff, these pink sentences here, honestly, you would have understood these sentences when you were like 8 years old. I mean, you totally would have. Like if you said to an 8-year-old, I like swimming and to run, and the 8-year-old is going to know that something is weird there. Yeah, whereas the 8-year-old would be totally fine with swimming and running. And if your first language isn't English, then there's going to be some equivalent in your first language with which the 8-year-old would also be fine. And you give me a smiley guy if that makes sense, what I'm saying there. So, okay. I mean, the reason why I'm pointing this out is that 8-year-olds have no idea what things like clauses are or grammar terms. So, like, if you're introducing those, then what you're doing is you're taking something that is supposed to be simple and you're making it not simple, and that's a problem. I don't want to do that. So, just you didn't know everything you needed to know when you were 8, of course. I mean, there's a lot of mechanical stuff that you have to memorize, and you wouldn't have known written language conventions when you were 8. But everything you did understand when you were 8 should be no more complicated now than it was then. I mean, if you're saying that's how the mind works, I mean, the mind doesn't normally overcomplicate things that used to be simple. I mean, that's actually not how the mind works almost ever. I mean, pretty much only in classrooms. But just make sure you guys don't do that. It's kind of making this harder. Okay, so yeah, the things that should match here are, and you can think of it as bullet points. If you were making a PowerPoint of the sentence or something, things that should match in this sentence. Yeah, all right, you have patients have to be warned. Patients warned of potential risks. Whatever tense that shows up in. And then the panel has to evaluate the experiment. Okay, so let's look at those. I mean, they have to match. They have to be in the same form. And these things are totally happening in the same time frame and the same situation, so they should also be in matching tenses. Like, parallel things do not always have to be in matching tenses. This is actually worth commenting on because people think this is a thing and it's not. So we'll come back to the problem in a second. But just remember that parallel structures don't have to have matching tenses if they're parallel verbs. Let me give you an example where they don't, where they couldn't do that. Like if I just give you a sentence that's pretty simple like this one. Ray recently graduated from the University of Florida and will be attending Harvard Business School in the fall. Okay. So we have parallel structures here. We're saying two things about Ray. One of them is this, and the other one is this. Give me a smiley face if it makes sense to you that these do not have to be in the same tense. And in fact, that they can't be in the same tense. Give me the other face. Give me one of those blue faces if that doesn't make sense. Because remember, tenses are a function of context. I mean, grammar-wise, all verb tenses are basically the same. But it's context and common sense that determines what tenses you should have. So this is something that happened in the past, and this is something that has not happened yet. So you don't need matching tenses. Don't think that you do. However, if the tense situation is exactly the same, like if the time frames are the same and the durations are the same and all of this kind of thing, which in this situation they are, is exactly the same. Time frames and durations, etc. So these should have the same tense. Which, that's not really a parallel thing. Like if you have anything in a sentence happening in the same time frame, it's going to get the same tense. So let's look what we got. If you have this, those don't match. Must be and would. Those are non-parallel. Nope, strike it. B's got that patients must be warned and that an independent panel evaluate. It might be worth writing those out to see what you're dealing with here. You have that patients must be warned. And that a panel evaluate. Those don't match. I mean, one of those is actually wrong, which we'll talk about very briefly in a second. But if one of these is a must-be, then the other one's got to be a must-be as well. So let me smiley face if that makes sense. These don't match either. Okay, this one, C's got kind of the same problem as B does. I mean, you've got that patients are warned, which is also incorrect by itself, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But then you also have that a panel evaluates. Again, these are not the same type of thing. These do not match each other. And then we have choice D, which nobody picked, so that's good. Well, you have one will and one would. And then finally in E, it's perfect. So E wins. Again, this one's kind of a warm-up. If you didn't get this problem right, which some of you didn't, then consider whether you were focused on parallel structures enough. I mean, what happens, the single hardest thing about sentence correction is actually just paying attention to whatever you're paying attention to. You know, because like this is a problem where we even told you, hey guys, we're testing parallelism today. And then these match and the other four don't. So it's pretty straightforward, but there were about 10 people who picked the wrong answer. If you're one of those 10 people, that probably means that you just like forgot that we were looking at parallelism. That's the single hardest thing here, staying focused on whatever you're focused on all the way through. So be careful of that. Are there any questions about this problem? If you have any, chat box. We don't use the raised hand here. Just go ahead and put your question in the chat box if you've got one, please. So, we study hall with like 50 people. We don't really use hand raising and microphones. That would definitely be a mess. If anybody else has questions, feel free to chat it. So okay, so these are not the same tense. These are, if we talk about this stuff, like patients are warned would just be the present tense. That would just be like I am happy, or the kids go to school every day. Guys, please don't click the hand raise button. Thanks. Okay. This is just a regular present tense. This one, sorry, rather. Give me a smiling face if that makes sense. Okay, this is the regular present tense. Now, I mean, this is definitely not the regular present tense. I mean, a panel evaluates. That would not, I mean, if this was the present tense, this would be a panel evaluates. If this were the present tense, this would be a mismatched subject and verb. So these are not the same. I mean, the way that the second one of these works is actually the way these things is, like the way demands and commands and requests and stuff like that. It has a name and I can't remember what it is, but it's in our strategy guide. If you have things like commands or orders or requests or statements of importance, like something like it is essential that you be on time to work tomorrow. Where this is not the present tense. In fact, this doesn't even have a tense. But the form that is here is the same as whatever it would be, like to be, this is be. To evaluate, this is evaluate. It's whatever the form would be with to in front of it. So that's what this is. But all you're supposed to notice here is these don't match. This is the present tense, and this isn't. You know, like if you wrote the top one in that tense, it would say that patient's be warned. And if you wrote the bottom one in the top tense, it would say evaluates with an S on the end. So you cannot interpret either of these as the tense of the other one. So hopefully that makes sense. Give me a smiley face if that makes sense. Okay. I don't know the terminology, so maybe I don't know what it. I actually don't know what an infinitive is. Okay. As far as the question about Jessica's question, what you don't want to get in the habit of doing is making up your own versions of GMAX problems. Like, really don't do that. I mean, there's a time and a place to make up your own examples, and that is when you learn a new type of principle. Then you should make a very simple sentence, like simple in the same way that these are simple here. Like these illustrate parallelism, and they illustrate absolutely nothing else at all about it. So these are the kinds of sentences you should make up yourself. But what you should not do ever is make up your own versions of problems that GMAC gave you. Because those problems, they have like 1,000 moving parts, and these problems only test like 1% of what could go wrong with an English sentence. Probably not even 1%. So if you start messing with their problems, you're going to create issues that are not tested on this exam. So stick with their answer choices, do their problems. Okay, cool. Let's move on to another problem. Okay. Let's talk about, let's do this one. Remember where the multiple choice answers are found. Please do not put your answer in the chat. Give you a little bit of time for that. Okay, let's finish this up pretty soon. If you don't have an answer choice, please pick one. While you do that question in the chat box about a timer, I mean, yeah, you should definitely not do that. Like, if you guys are used to staring at timers on the individual problems, then you better stop that, like, right now. Like, honestly, you should not look at the timer more than about maybe 2 times per section, twice in the verbal section and twice in the quant. The rest of the time it should be off the screen and you should not be looking at it. You're allowed to hide it on the official test, and that is what you should absolutely do. Because like every time you look at that timer, you're going to look at it, you're going to stress out, you're going to get distracted, you're going to subtract numbers, you're going to recalculate, you're going to recalibrate, you're going to do like all these things. And then you're going to have to try to get back down to business. I mean, that's a loss of like 15, 30 seconds every time you look at that timer. If you're doing that every problem, I mean, guys, you're probably spending 15, 20 minutes per section looking at that timer. That's a lot of time. So if you do that, you're not going to finish. So, I mean, time management has nothing to do with minutes and seconds, neither on quant nor on verbal. It's time management is just knowing when you're stuck and then not staring at the board. That is literally all that time management is. It's just not staring at stuff and not trying to do the same thing 5 times. Like if you're looking at certain words and you don't figure out what's going on with them, don't keep looking at the same words. Just gotta move on. That's all it is. It's like you're driving somewhere. Like if you got lost, you wouldn't start randomly driving around in random directions. You would stop driving and you'd pull over and you would consult something, either a map or a friend or something, but you would not keep driving at random. This is the same sort of thing. It's just like knowing, okay, I'm lost, it's time to pull over. That's actually all that time management is. Okay, but yeah, no, having timer on the screen every single time, whoa, yeah, don't do it. Okay, let's talk about this problem. Before we talk about this problem, let's talk about these. I'm going to kill your answers from the last problem. I got a distribution here, but let's delete this. Take a look at these. I mean, obviously these sentences are not as formal as what you would see on the test, but that's the point. The point is to make these very accessible and friendly sentences, right? So look at these. One of each pair works. So here's the way I want you guys to vote on this. In the multiple choice section, if you could give me choice, let's number these. 1, 2, 3, 4. Give me choice A if number 1 and number 3 are correct. Give me choice, somebody already picked a choice. That's interesting. Give me choice B if number 1 and number 4 are correct. Give me choice C if number 2 and number 3 are correct. And give me choice D if number 2 and number 4 are correct. In the same multiple choice section where you pick the answers to the problems. This is hopefully something that will not take longer than 30 seconds, maybe. Okay, I'll give you another like 10 or 15 seconds to do that, but you should pick something soon. Okay, there's a couple of you who don't have answers, but let's move on with discussing this. So, okay, when we talked about problem, where are you, problem? Okay, when we talked about this problem, notice this word that we wrote. This word, we wrote the word should. What is that? Like when you are not taking random arbitrary words and making them match. If you're doing that, it's going to get you in loads of trouble. I mean, what is this should all about? Can anybody give me a concise summary of that? Like, when should stuff actually match? In a parallelism sense. I mean, there is also matching of subject and verb, although that's not the kind of, like, we're not talking about agreement. So if you're subject and verbs or pronouns and nouns, those are things too, but those are not the thing that we're talking about here. We're talking about parallel structure. Okay, let's go back. Yeah, it's kind of what SN is saying. That's the best explanation in the box right now, where it says descriptions about the same type of thing. It's going to be hard to do this in words, because what you can't do, because it's impossible, is to make a rule for it. So it's not the same time frame. In fact, we already talked about this example to disprove that it has to be the same time frame. I mean, like these are parallel structures. graduated and will be attending. I mean, those are parallel. They're not in the same tense, but verb and verb. But let's talk about something that you probably know how to do, which is making bullet points on like a PowerPoint slide. You probably know how to do that. If you're going to put this on PowerPoint, I mean, would these three things in this pair, would these three things get the same type of bullet point? Like if I said bullet, devoured lunch, bullet, crunched, bullet, swallowed, does that make any sense? No way, right? Of course it doesn't. Because these are not three things. Yeah, you would indent that. That's what you would do. This is nonsense, the way this is done. Because these are not A, B, and C, or 1, 2, and 3. It doesn't make any sense. Because crunching and swallowing describe how somebody ate lunch. So, and I mean, this is why they test this stuff a lot, because nobody ever had to explain to you how this works. You know, like when you were in 7th grade or 8th grade or whatever it was when you started making outlines like this, I mean, no one ever had to give you a lesson on here is when you indent and here is when you don't. Like you just kind of get it. It's a native concept, like your brain. I mean, things that are sub-points of other things, you indent. So like, yeah, it would be more like devoured lunch. And then as sub-points of that, you have crunch and swallow. Yeah, this is the way you would make that slide. Give me a smiley face, if that makes sense. You can give me another face that doesn't, but hopefully it does. These two things are descriptions of that. These two are. Yeah, you bet they are. So you do not want to put all three of these in parallel. If you put all three of these in parallel, you get nonsense, because they shouldn't be. So this is not like take random words and make them parallel. It's not what it is. It's like you have to understand the meaning first, just as you always do. Remember, the first step of every sentence correction problem is, what is the meaning of this? What are they trying to tell me? You got to understand that first. So this is sentence 1, and so sentence 1 is wrong because sentence 1 is nonsense. Then sentence 2, we have this comma ing modifier. If you know about those, if you don't know about those, we've actually had study hall sessions specifically on that type of modifier. But comma ing, in this case, there are two parts to that. There's two INGs. But this is all one big comma ing modifier. And the way that works is it modifies the action that came before it. So if you don't know how those work, they're in our strategy guide. We also have study hall sessions on it. But comma ing is perfect here. Describes this action. This is exactly what we want to do. So this is the one that works out of these two. As opposed to these two that are down here. I mean, these three things are genuinely different things. Like if you were going to bullet point this, these would actually get 3 bullets. Ate lunch, gulped drinks, fell asleep. These are actually 3 different things. So these 3 you actually want to all be parallel. Give me a smiley face, if that makes sense. The structure of number 4 is exactly the same as the structure of number 2, but it doesn't make any sense. Because like number 4 is written like this. It's written like, okay, you devour your lunch. And then as a sub-point of that, you gulp drinks. And then there's another sub-point of that, you fall asleep. What? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, falling asleep is not part of eating lunch. You could make a case that gulping drinks might be, but this is nonsense because they're supposed to be different things. A modifier doesn't make any sense here. So, all right, give me a smiley face and we're good with this. This is not a thing because this doesn't work. I mean, notice there's no formula for this, right? Like a smiley face means, remember those faces that are underneath your name? Not in the chat. There should be those emoticons that are under your name. You can't make formulas for it, right? Like the template of number 1 and number 3 is the same, but the first step is to understand the meaning. And if the meanings are not the same, it's not going to work the same way. So now let's think about this. Let's think about bullet points on a PowerPoint outline. Let's think about that here. I mean, who can tell me like what actually does get the same kind of bullet point in this sentence? And remember, when you look at these, the original sentence is going to be wrong 80% of the time. I mean, the right answer is only A 1/5 of the time. So just keep that in mind, that most of the time you'll be looking at a wrong version of the sentence. So it's the way they structure choice A is not particularly important. It's the ideas that are in it, and then you figure out how it should be structured. So yeah, I mean, there's two things that insurance plans do. They impose limits, and they require doctors to see a larger number of patients. You bet. They do that. There's two things. And I mean, you know, insurance plans don't spend time with patients. So if that last thing was parallel with those, that would be a serious problem. But these are two things that insurance plans do, like two characteristics of insurance plans. Whereas like spending less time is not, insurance plans don't do that. So there's no way that could be in parallel with those other things. Like doctors do this. And what's the relationship between that and the orange stuff? Like what's the relationship between spending less time and seeing more patients? Are those independent of each other? Yeah, this is a relationship, right? Like you have this, because if those were, because again, if you look at this, if you genuinely had different things that were different things, then you could put them in parallel. But are these different? Like, are these actually independent ideas? Or are they related? And can anybody specify how they are related? And notice that all of the stuff we're doing now is stuff that you should absolutely do before you even look at the answer choices. Like you don't even look at the choices until you have done this stuff. Yeah, it's cause and effect, you bet, right? Like this is cause and this is effect. I mean, if you have to see more patients, then that's going to mean as a direct consequence that you're going to spend less time with each one, because that's, you know, there's only so many hours in your workday. So when you have cause and effect, it's inappropriate to use a parallel structure because they're not 2 bullet points. It should be one thing and then a modifier because of that relationship. So these should not be parallel. They are in choice A, but we don't care because choice A is usually wrong. So these should not be parallel. And then if you know, I mean, cause and effect is another thing that comma ing is perfect for. So you could anticipate using a comma ing here. I mean, don't kill yourself trying to anticipate how these are going to work, but if there is a kind of modifier or some kind of structure that especially does what you have in mind, then you might want to think about it first. So I'm just smiling if that makes sense. Most important thing is you should do all of this advanced thinking before you even go to the choices. In fact, you should easily spend like 70% of the time on the original, like maybe 30% of the time on all the choices, because you want to have all of this figured out before your eyes even go down here. Because if you don't, I mean, if you don't, like one thing that should never ever happen is you have to go back up there and figure out meaning. If that ever happens, that's like a big failure of understanding the original. Like anything that has to do with relationships or intended meaning or something like that, all of that should be figured out before you even go to the choices. Important thing. Okay, so if we look at this, impose and require, those should be parallel. Let's see how much. I mean, okay, like there's a question in the chat about reading through the choices and marking. I mean, if you can just read through these cold and mark off the ones that are incorrect, like if that's a thing that you can do even decently often, then you'll honestly be getting pretty much all of these problems right already. Like if you can even do that, because like picking out errors cold is not a thing that you're going to want to try to do. I mean, you kind of have to be at the level of a professional writer or editor to be able to do that with any consistency. So, but that's why there are multiple choices. I mean, so that you don't have to do that. But that, like what you're talking about doing there is like 1,000 times harder than comparing multiple choices. So be careful of that. But okay, these things that should be parallel are the orange things. So imposing and requiring in choice A, that's fine. That part is at least. Imposing comma requiring, that's not fine. I mean, you need and here. So you don't want to pay attention to splits while you read either, because that sounds good in practice, but all that means is you are going to think only about that, and you're going to ignore every single other thing happening in the sentence. And then it's kind of like being back to the beginning every single time. I mean, it's because you're going to look at the splits anyway. So, but you need to be careful with that. I mean, because I mean, the way you read the original sentence is actually a lot like the way you read normal books. It's like if you read something like this in a book, you wouldn't keep reading if any of this stuff was unclear, right? Like if you didn't know exactly that like insurance plans do A, this, and B, that, you would stop and you'd be like, I didn't catch that. I didn't know exactly what was in the list. You'd go back, you'd figure it out. Like if you didn't realize this was cause and effect, you would go back. Like all of this, a normal reader would not tolerate lack of understanding of these things. So the way you read normal books is actually pretty demanding. But the reason why it works is that you're not thinking about grammar when you read normal books. Like the first read has nothing to do at all with grammar or mechanics or any of that. It's just like, what are they telling me? How are these related? And then you can look at all the splits and start thinking about that kind of stuff. So you can't connect two parallel structures by just putting comma there. So you need and. So this doesn't work. It's out. C tries to put all of these in parallel, and we know you can't do that. Because you can't put things that insurance plans do in parallel with things that doctors do. And then, okay, impose and require, those are all right. Impose, comma, requiring same problem as B, so nope. That leaves us with A, alligator, and D, dog. And then you got this other relationship. You have things that are not supposed to be parallel and that are incorrect if they are parallel. That's the red things. So you don't want this to be C and spend because those shouldn't be parallel. In the same way that these should not be parallel. Like this is an incorrect sentence if all three of these are parallel. Same thing with C and spend, because those are not two different things that doctors do. Right? That is a clear cause and effect relationship. Give me a smiley if that makes sense. Whereas, again, you have this comma ing relationship, which is fantastic. So same sort of thing as this, actually, as this one here. Devoured his lunch, comma, blah, 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 blah. Or like as a simpler illustration of that. Immediate effect, immediate cause and effect. Like if you, I dumped a gallon of oil into the swimming pool, comma, creating a biohazard that forced the closure of the pool. Okay, I mean, you could also use comma ing to do this, where it is, there's your action, there's your immediate, unavoidable consequence of it. It's not a delayed thing. This is immediately what resulted from that. That kind of cause-effect relationship, comma ing can do that. Immediate, unavoidable effect. So that's the same sort of thing that's happening here with these. Okay, give me a smiley if that makes sense. And notice you can get there by just eliminating A. You can just be like, those are parallel, that's wrong. And then if you later, you can go back and study this choice and figure out exactly what's going on here. But this is, so what comma ing doesn't do is that. That's actually the express purpose of comma ings is to not do that. There are lots of other modifiers that do, but this is very specifically a modifier that doesn't just do the noun in front of it. There's a lot of, it has to be some sort of relationship to that action. So spending is not a modifier of insurance plans. No, not sure what the question is. I mean, this is, the nearest action doesn't have to be a complete sentence. It's just the nearest action. Here, the nearest action is this, see more patients. So these can do that. Yeah, I mean, there are, I think there's 2 or 3 different study halls on comma ings. So we should probably not get too much further off track with that. If you have any other questions that are about the parallel structure, especially that hit me with that. No, we'll look at another one. Yeah, check it out. There's so many of these study halls. There's just tons of them. Okay. I think 200 by this point. let's look at this one. How about do it. Okay, remember where the multiple choice answers are found. Remember, before your eyes even go anywhere near the choices, you should pretty much understand exactly what the relationships are and what the main skeleton of the sentence should be structured like, especially things being parallel or not parallel. I mean, like, that is, if you don't know exactly what is parallel or should be parallel, then that means you don't understand what the sentence is telling you. Because you can't claim to understand the meaning but not know which things are supposed to be parallel. So, okay, go for it. Okay, while you finish this up, Oral, were you here when I gave that first little bit about time management? Okay, because there's two things that you might mean by that. So this is, let me put the question up on the board and address it quickly. We'll come back to the problem. Okay, so what I want you to think about here is an analogy. When you think about ballroom dancing, like, let's say that you don't know how to do it, the tango or something like that, and you're just learning. So think about the way that you would kind of naturally segregate that into two different pieces. Like, the first thing that you do when you learn ballroom dance, or like really anything that has a physical technique with any type of precision, is you don't worry about speed. You learn good technique, even at a painfully slow, like at first, at a very slow pace. Because if you try to speed this up when you are still learning dance steps, that is not going to turn out well. Right? It's really slow. And then once you have good technique consistently, then that's when you start worrying about efficiency and tempo and stuff. So only then do you start trying to speed up the steps. This is the same way that you should do these problems. Like, if the concepts are not clear, and if you're still like getting your feet wet when it comes to what parallel structures are, if that takes a really long time at first, then you should take a really long time at first. So you should do the same thing with these problems. Like, if the concepts are slow at first, That's fine. For other, not for sentence correction, but for things like quant where you have to organize stuff, if you are not used to organizing stuff, it's going to take you a really long time at first, but worth it. And then you can worry about that. But there's one thing, do not misinterpret this advice in a certain way. Like no matter what, like being slow is one thing, but no matter how slow or, you know, sort of beginner mistakes you're making, no matter how slow you are at first, you should never, ever, ever stare at the board. Like that advice about time management is always in effect. Like if you are genuinely stuck, you quit. You don't keep doing it ever. I mean, these are two very different things, right? If you are just getting used to some idea and you are slow at it, then that's fine as long as you are doing something. Like as long as you're actually, you know, getting somewhere and thinking through something specific. But as soon as you get to the point where you're honestly just stuck and taking random stabs at things, you stop. So in terms of, so basically at the end of the day, it depends on what you mean when you say thinking about timing. If you're thinking about this is always a thing. Always, always. But if you're talking about, you know, being super, not super, you don't have to be super fast. I mean, I'm not super fast. But like, if you're talking about being decently fast, then that comes later. But if you're talking about not wasting time, that's always. So give me a smile if that makes sense. Okay, back to the problem. So, okay, let's cover the choices up. There's about 10 or 12 of you who haven't picked choices yet, so you should do that. Let's talk about this before let's cover the choices. Okay, there's still a bunch of non-responders, but we gotta move with this. Oh, give me some bullet points here, guys. Like what is bullet points for sure here? Keep in mind that the original is usually wrong. Like this is purely thinking about ideas. Yeah, reduce 3 things. I mean, this is a list of 3, which there's no way that you could possibly structure this as anything except for a list of 3. That, and that. Your smiley face if that makes sense. The question is, what if you can't understand the meaning? There should not ever be such a thing as can't understand the meaning. Because, I mean, these sentences are not obscure, super difficult abstractions. I mean, these, you know, they're formal language and they're about kind of boring topics, but there should never be a situation where you can't understand what they're trying to say. If you think about grammar when you're reading, then you might not be able to understand it. But if you think about reading books or emails or websites, I mean, no one thinks about grammar when they read those things. As long as your first reading is like reading a book, you'll be fine. But just no thinking about grammar when you first read the sentence. This cardinal state, don't do it. Okay. There are 3 things that have been reduced. How do you make a list of 3 things? There's only one way to do that. What is it? Yep, that's the only way that you can do it. So these three things have to appear in that form. They must. A, B, comma, and C. Like a genre, I'm sorry, but I don't understand what you are asking. These have to be in this form. They have to be A, B, and C. So that means that it has to say sickness, sleeping on the job, and fatigue. It doesn't matter that the word "and" is not here right now. It has to be there. If it's not there, this is incorrect. And you can, so first word of the underline, it has to be "and." If it's not, wrong. Period. End of story. No reason to look past the first word. Well, look at that. That means that three choices are immediately gone. Gone, gone, gone. Like anything that does not say "and." These are the only choices that are left, are C and E. I mean, the other thing that you shouldn't do, I think a lot of people do this, is I think a lot of people think that somehow simpler structures will change if you insert them into bigger structures, and that's not true. Like, if you make a list of three things, it will always look like that. It doesn't matter what is happening around it. Like, if you say, I bought A, B, and C, you can also say, I bought A, B, and C, and then walked out of the store. I mean, the point is this list is still going to be structured in the same way every time. Like, the rule for making this is not different. So if you try, I mean, some people try to make these kind of interesting but totally wrong constructions. Like, they try to write something like this. This is not a thing. You can't do it. I mean, because A, B, C, and walked, those are not parallel things. I mean, this is nice because what basically it's kind of like this much is kind of like math equations where the individual pieces don't react to their surroundings. You know, like if you have to factor some quadratic, then it's going to factor the same way, whether it's the entire expression or whether it's a tiny piece of it. Like if you can factor it, then you can factor it. So, but if the list is A, B, and C, then it's A, B, and C. It doesn't suddenly allow you to get rid of "and" if it's part of some larger structure. So this is nice because, you know, the principles are the same. It doesn't depend on the surrounding. So, I mean, you should not be thinking of this as "and, C, and," because those are parts of two completely different structures. I mean, you have, this is one of your parallel structures, and this is the other one. I mean, you can't break this up like that because those are parts of two totally different things. I mean, hopefully that makes sense. I mean, if we want to take this math analogy a little further, it's kind of like saying x, y plus wz. When you say "and, C, and," that's kind of like trying to pull y plus w out of this. I mean, you can't. Well, x, y is one piece, and wz is the other piece. So same kind of thing here. Leave it with C and E. I mean, you cannot say A and B and C. Nope. Unless they're parts of different things. I mean, you could again, I mean, make sure that you guys are not trying to memorize a lot of templates here. That is the other thing that will just destroy you in sentence correction, is if you try to like memorize macro templates for entire sentences. I mean, you could have two ands like that if they were parts of different constructions. Like, for example, if you say, you could say, I bought A and B, and then walk out of the store. Sure, you could. I mean, this is not A and B and something else. I mean, this is, again, this is one thing that you did, and this is the other thing that you did. I mean, if you're reading these things like you read a book at first, then this will be very clear. I mean, you would know that this was a thing, and this was the other thing. If you're processing this as A and B and something else, then it means you're basically ignoring what it means entirely. And you can't do that. So, no, D would still not be correct. There's no way to make D right. It would be a nonsense structure no matter what. Okay. Between these two, I mean, it's pretty clear that E is not right because, I mean, nobody picked it, but E's got a couple of glaring problems. I mean, now that you have that, we can just treat this entire list as stuff. That's the first half of stuff. And this is the second half of stuff. So C just says these equations reduced stuff, things, while raising other things, is what that says. This, on the other hand, says they reduced things was lowered. I mean, that is definitely not right. Two big problems there. I mean, the first thing is they reduced things would be a sentence, and things were lowered would be a sentence, but you can't stick those to each other. Make sure that you guys are not editing the answer choices. Don't do it. Like, do not ever do that. Do not try to make your own changes to answer choices. Don't do it. Okay. So E is not a thing. That leaves us with C. Now, the other point to make about this problem is, like, this business at the end right here, it's a non-issue if you notice that there are three things that were lowered. Which, I mean, your attention should be on this anyway, because this is at the border of the non-underlined and underlined part. So you should already be paying attention to that. But what they're doing here is they're making something as like a penalty for not noticing that. Like that is actually what they're doing there. Like this difference, that's basically there to distract you and to punish people who don't notice the much easier thing at the start. That's actually what that is doing. This is here to distract you from easier stuff. And basically to penalize you for not seeing the straightforward things at the beginning. A, comma, B, comma, and C. I mean, they actually do that a lot. Like when there are answer choices that contain super fundamental errors, those answer choices also tend to contain a lot of things that you aren't even supposed to be looking at, or that you don't even need to solve the problem. But that if you miss those fundamental things, you're gonna get caught in this mud here. You don't want to do that. I mean, again, so there's this question in the chat box. I mean, parallel structures should not be subtle. I mean, they really should not ever. I mean, just think about making PowerPoint slides again. I mean, if you have bullet point, other bullet point, that is never going to be subtle. Like either things are bullet points or they're not bullet points. I mean, at least that should be not subtle. And if there is a list of things in a sentence, then it's pretty clear it's a list of things. So if you're thinking of it as subtle, that probably means, again, that you're thinking about grammar while you're reading. If you try to think about grammar as you read, that will destroy you. If you just read the sentence and kind of think about how you would put it on a PowerPoint slide, you'll find that that's not really an issue, I promise you. But I mean, as far as this difference goes, I mean, it does make more sense to say while raising, because if you think about it, these are shift work equations. I mean, they're called shift work equations. So who are they supposed to help? Like what is their purpose? Why would you have? Yeah, they're supposed to help the workers, right? And they're shift work equations. So if you look at these, again, I'm going to give you a disclaimer, which is that you're never going to need differences this subtle to solve the problems. So I'm going to just write that. Because people are kind of stubborn about this stuff. But disclaimer, like if you are ever thinking about anything this subtle, you probably overlooked something that is much less subtle. But nonetheless, we can talk about it for like 45 seconds. But anything below this line, you're not going to need for these problems. But let me just tell you what's happening there anyway. So sleeping is a noun in that sentence. I mean, there's no word like sleepness or like sleepation or whatever. So sleeping is the noun form there. So that last thing may be true. I have no idea what that word is, but grammar terms. Remember, if you're using these grammar terms, that they're not going to help you guys. I mean, they will just make this stuff seem complicated when it's not. So, but I mean, sleeping is, if you're going to make a noun out of that, that's the noun you're going to make out of it. So, you guys know that nouns can end with ing. Like, I like swimming. Swimming is a noun. Swimming is an Olympic sport. There you go. Okay, let's do this. We gotta get out of here in a couple of minutes. So let me just tell you what's happening there at the end. If you say like these things, x reduced y and raised z. I mean, these are parallel structures, which would mean that they have equal importance. That's pretty much by definition what parallel structures do. Is same thing as bullet points on a PowerPoint slide. You're saying that they have equal priority pretty much. Whereas if you have x reduced y while raising z, and then that last part's a modifier. I mean, by definition, modifiers have lesser importance than the main sentence, which is why they are modifiers. So, meaning in this structure, this is the main point, and this is a side point, and it's less important. I mean, this is precisely what's going on here, because I mean, these are shift work equations. They are not productivity or throughput equations. So it is absolutely not equally important to help the shift workers and also, you know, increase company profits. I mean, heck no, it's not. I mean, this is basically these equations help workers. Oh, and by the way, as kind of a fortunate side point, they also happen to do this, but this is much less important. And that's why it's a modifier. Now, the point is that you don't have to think about that. I mean, this is definitely not black and white, whereas x, y, and z is absolutely black and white. So if you do find yourself thinking about any differences that are this nuanced, you should back up a step and ask yourself whether you are missing anything black and white, because that's usually a sign that you are. I mean, they will not give you problems where you have to do this much thinking. But it's kind of neat to occasionally think about it in retrospect. The main thing here, though, this is a list. Bam, bam, bam. It's the first thing you encounter, so you got to nail it. You know, once you do, everything's off the table except C and E. Okay, we are past the time, and you're welcome. Thank you for that. I'm on a tighter schedule than usual today, so I gotta shut this show down here. But I think I have a few more of these problems collected, so we'll probably do more of this next time. So basically pick up where we left off with this. And then thanks. The next study hall I do believe is in 1 week from today. That's not the usual spacing. They're not usually 1 week apart. They're usually 2 weeks apart. But because of things like holiday travel, stuff like that, the next one I think is in 1 week. But you should still check the website to make sure that's right. Okay, thank you guys.